The letter that came back. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Typed on official HOA letterhead, sealed with the kind of officious self-importance that only people with just a little bit of power ever manage to achieve. And inside, in cold, bureaucratic language, it told a third-generation farmer named Gerald Harmon that he had 30 days. 30 days to vacate his own land. The land his grandfather had broken with his bare hands. The land whose soil held 80 years of his family's sweat and history. Leave it, the letter said, or the Sycamore Ridge Homeowners Association would pursue forced forfeiture proceedings against his property. Gerald read that letter twice. Then he set it down on his grandfather's handmade kitchen table. He walked to the window. He looked out at his fields. And then, very quietly, Gerald Harmon smiled. Because what the HOA board of Sycamore Ridge did not know, what they had never bothered to check, was that Gerald Harmon didn't just own his farmhouse. Gerald Harmon held the mortgage note on the financial instrument that the entire neighborhood was built upon. He wasn't just the man at the edge of their community. He was, in a very real and very recorded legal sense, the man who held debt over the ground beneath their feet. He didn't just own the land. He owned the debt. To understand how that was even possible, you have to go back. Back before the cul-de-sacs and the community pool and the vinyl siding and the 17 approved exterior paint colors. Back to when none of it existed. Back to when the land that would become Sycamore Ridge Estates was simply called the Harmon Tract. Elias Harmon homesteaded that land in the 1940s. He grew soybeans. He raised cattle. He built a house from lumber he milled himself with his own hands on his own property, because that was the kind of man he was. When Elias passed, the land went to his son Robert. When Robert passed, it went to Gerald. 3 generations. 1 family. 1 piece of ground that they had worked and kept and protected for over 80 years. Gerald grew up on that land before he understood what ownership meant. He learned to drive a tractor before he learned to ride a bicycle. He knew every fence line by memory. Every seasonal creek. Every soft patch of soil where the water table crept close to the surface in early spring. This was not investment property to Gerald Harmon. This was his life, his inheritance, and the only place he had ever truly called home. But Gerald was also a practical man. And in the early 2000s, when suburban development began spreading outward from the nearest city the way water finds cracks in concrete, Gerald made a decision. He sold a portion of his land. Not all of it. He was careful about that. He kept the original farmhouse, the barns, the south field, the north pasture. What he sold was roughly 220 acres of the flattest, most developable ground. The section that would eventually become Sycamore Ridge Estates. The company that bought it was a regional developer called Meridian Home Group. They partnered with First Henderson Community Bank to finance the construction loans and eventually the individual home mortgages for the buyers who moved in. Over the next 4 years, they built the neighborhood. 340 homes, a community pool, manicured common areas, a gate at the entrance with a stone sign that said Sycamore Ridge Estates in carved letters, as if it had always been there and always would be. And from the very beginning, as with virtually every planned community of its kind, there was a homeowners association. The Sycamore Ridge HOA was established under a declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, a CC&R document that Meridian Home Group drafted before the first house was ever framed. These CC and RS are binding legal documents. They travel with the land. Every buyer who purchased a home in Sycamore Ridge signed an agreement to live by them. And here is where the story, quietly and invisibly, begins to curl back on itself. Because when Gerald sold those 220 acres to Meridian Home Group, he did not take the entire purchase price in cash. He accepted a portion of it in the form of a seller-financed note, a private mortgage instrument in which Meridian agreed to pay Gerald a fixed sum over 20 years, with interest secured against the property itself. In plain language, Gerald became the lender. Meridian became the borrower. And Gerald held a recorded lien, a legally documented financial claim, tied to the land beneath what would become Sycamore Ridge. Over the years, Meridian completed the development, sold off the individual homes, and wound down its operations. First Henderson Community Bank, through a series of institutional transactions that no HOA board member would ever think to investigate, eventually came to hold certain interests connected to Meridian's outstanding obligations, including interests related to Gerald's original seller finance note. The financial structure became layered and complex. But at the very bottom of all those layers, Gerald Harmon's name was still there. Attached to a recorded instrument, documented at the Henderson County Recorder's Office. Legally valid. Fully enforceable. Gerald knew this. His attorney knew this. His accountant knew this. The HOA board of Sycamore Ridge did not know this. They had never looked. And they would spend the next several months paying dearly for that ignorance. For the first several years after Sycamore Ridge was built, Gerald and his new neighbors coexisted without serious conflict. His farmhouse sat at the edge of the development, technically outside the HOA's geographic boundaries, but visible from several of the newer homes. His barn was painted a deep red his grandfather had chosen in 1952. And that red was not among the 17 approved exterior colors in the CC and RS. Occasionally, his cattle wandered close enough to the perimeter fence to make certain residents uneasy. But Gerald reinforced his fencing, kept his property tidy, minded his business. There was no war. There was no tension worth noting. Two worlds occupied the same edge of Henderson County. And they mostly left each other alone. Then the board changed. The previous HOA board, a relaxed group of retirees and working parents who met quarterly, focused on the community pool, and treated their neighbors like neighbors, was voted out in what one resident later described as the most contentious neighborhood election since the cul-de-sac speed bump vote. The new board was led by a woman named Patricia Kellner. She had moved into Sycamore Ridge about 18 months earlier. She had relocated from a gated community in another state. A community with, by all accounts, an exceptionally aggressive HOA culture. Patricia brought that culture with her. Within 6 months of taking the board chairmanship, Patricia's board had issued over 400 violation notices to residents of Sycamore Ridge. Notices for garbage cans left visible past 7 in the evening on collection day. Notices for basketball hoops positioned 3 inches outside the approved driveway boundary. Notices for wind chimes that the board had officially classified as acoustically noncompliant. Fines accumulated. Homeowners who couldn't or wouldn't pay found liens filed against their properties. 2 families were sent to collections. An elderly couple received a threatening letter about their decorative garden gnomes, which Patricia's board had determined were unsanctioned lawn ornamentation under the CC and RS. The community was in an uproar. Board meetings became shouting matches. At least a dozen residents were reportedly consulting attorneys. The neighborhood that Meridian Home Group had built as a peaceful planned community had become, under Patricia's leadership, something closer to an occupied territory. Gerald Harmon, out on his farmhouse property, watched all of it from a distance. None of it touched him. He wasn't inside the HOA. Their rules didn't apply to him. He watched, kept his head down, tended his land, until the first letter arrived. It came on a Monday in March, addressed to Gerald's farmhouse, typed on Sycamore Ridge HOA letterhead. And it informed him that his property, specifically his barn, his equipment shed, and his hay storage structure, were in violation of something called the Sycamore Ridge Aesthetic Corridor Policy. This policy, the letter explained, extended the HOA's visual jurisdiction to any property visible from within the Sycamore Ridge boundaries, regardless of whether that property was actually located inside the HOA's geographic footprint. Gerald stared at that letter for a long time. Then he called his attorney. Dale Whitfield. Dale had practiced property law in Henderson County for 31 years. He had seen a great deal of creative legal interpretation in his career. But even he paused when Gerald read the letter over the phone. There was a long silence, and then Dale responded in a way that confirmed immediately that this was not a legitimate policy. Dale sent a measured, professional response to the HOA. He explained that Gerald's property was not subject to HOA jurisdiction, that the aesthetic corridor policy had no legal grounding in the recorded CC and RS, and that any further correspondence of this nature would be considered harassment. The letter was polite, thorough, and absolutely clear. The HOA board ignored it. A second letter arrived 6 weeks later. This one had escalated. It referenced something called the Henderson County Rural-Urban Interface Ordinance, citing it as additional legal authority for the HOA's position. When Dale investigated, he discovered something remarkable. The ordinance did not exist. It was not in the county code. There was no record of it in any public database. The HOA's board had either fabricated it entirely, been misled by whoever drafted their correspondence, or simply hoped that Gerald wouldn't bother to check. Gerald checked. Dale checked. The ordinance was nowhere. A third letter arrived 2 months after that, and this one dropped all pretense. It informed Gerald Harmon that the Sycamore Ridge HOA, acting under its claimed aesthetic corridor authority, was initiating forfeiture proceedings against his property. It alleged that his ongoing noncompliance constituted a nuisance under state property law, and it stated that the HOA had retained legal counsel to pursue the matter to its conclusion. This was the letter Gerald set down on his grandfather's table. This was the letter that made him smile, because Gerald Harmon had not simply been farming his land while Sycamore Ridge grew up around him. He had also been quietly, carefully, methodically managing his financial interests. And 3 years earlier, his attorney Dale had made a discovery that changed everything. While doing an unrelated title review on an adjacent parcel, Dale had found a gap. A missing assignment in the chain of title related to Gerald's original seller-financed note. A recording error at the Henderson County Recorder's office. Small, technical, invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. That had created a defect in how the note's ownership had been transferred through the institutional transactions involving First Henderson Community Bank. Nobody had caught it, because nobody had been looking. Dale brought it to Gerald's attention, and Gerald, on Dale's advice, spent the next 18 months doing something that required patience, legal precision, and a very clear understanding of what he was building. He reacquired the full, unencumbered beneficial interest in his original seller-financed note. He worked through the proper legal channels, corrected the recording errors, filed the appropriate assignments, and ultimately emerged as the sole, clear, recorded holder of a mortgage instrument secured against the very land parcel from which Sycamore Ridge Estates had been subdivided. Now, to be precise about what this meant, because precision matters here, Gerald did not own the individual homes in Sycamore Ridge. He did not hold mortgages on the houses that Patricia Kellner and her neighbors lived in. What he held was a lien position on the underlying master land parcel, the foundational ground from which the entire subdivision had been created, related to the original seller financing arrangement that had never been fully extinguished through the chain of transactions. In a worst-case legal scenario, which Dale had prepared in writing with full case citations, this instrument, if Gerald chose to enforce it, could create title complications for every single property in Sycamore Ridge. It could cloud the ability to sell, refinance, transfer any home in the development until the underlying lien was resolved, negotiated, or paid off. It was not a weapon Gerald had ever intended to use. He had simply cleaned up a title defect, asserted his legitimate legal interest, and gone back to farming. He had no grievance with his neighbors. He bore no ill will toward the people who had bought homes on land his grandfather once owned. He was a farmer, not a litigant. And for 3 years after he had reacquired that note, he had done absolutely nothing with it. Then the HOA sent him 3 letters threatening to seize his farm. Dale drafted the response personally. According to people who have since read it, it remains one of the most methodically devastating legal letters produced in Henderson County. It was sent via certified mail, and simultaneously hand-delivered by courier. 1 copy to the HOA board. 1 copy to the law firm the HOA claimed to have retained. And 1 copy filed with the Henderson County Recorder's Office for the public record. It was 4 pages long. The first page dismantled every legal claim the HOA had made. The aesthetic corridor policy, the fabricated ordinance, the forfeiture threat, each one addressed individually, each one demolished with specific statutory citations and case law references. The word fabricated appeared twice. The phrase legally unsupportable appeared 4 times. The letter made clear that the HOA's own attorney, if they genuinely had one, would give them the same advice Dale was giving them now, which was to stop immediately. The second page was a documented history of Gerald's property ownership. The legal description, the recorded boundaries, the chain of title going back to his grandfather, demonstrating conclusively and in exhaustive detail that the Harmon farmhouse property had never been subject to the Sycamore Ridge CC and RS. It had no legal connection to the HOA's jurisdiction, and it could not be made subject to it by a policy the board had invented without a proper community vote. The third page was a formal notice. It informed the HOA board of Sycamore Ridge, in careful, fully documented, exhibit-supported language, that Gerald Harmon was the current recorded beneficial holder of a mortgage instrument secured against the master land parcel underlying Sycamore Ridge estates. It attached the recorded assignment documents as exhibits. It cited the instrument by recording number, book, and page, so that anyone who wished to verify the information needed only to walk into the Henderson County Recorder's office and ask. And it stated plainly, any further attempt by the HOA to pursue action against Gerald Harmon's property would be treated as tortious interference with his property rights, and that Gerald reserved the right to pursue all available legal remedies, including remedies related to his recorded lien interest, to the fullest extent the law permitted. The 4th page contained a single sentence. Mr. Harmon looks forward to your prompt written confirmation that this matter is closed. Patricia Kellner called an emergency board meeting. It lasted 3.5 hours. According to a board member who later resigned in protest and spoke to people familiar with the situation, Patricia spent a significant portion of that meeting insisting that the letter was a bluff, that the lien documents were forgeries, and that Gerald Harmon was, in her words, a country farmer who doesn't know how to play hardball. The HOA's attorney, the one they had just actually retained, it turned out was on speakerphone for part of the meeting. That attorney did not agree with Patricia's assessment. When the attorney finished speaking, the room was silent for approximately 45 seconds, and then Patricia Kellner said, to no one in particular, "Well, who authorized us to send those letters to him in the first place?" Nobody answered her, because everyone in that room knew the answer was Patricia Kellner. Within 72 hours, the HOA's attorney sent a formal written response to Dale Whitfield. It acknowledged that the aesthetic corridor policy did not apply to properties outside the HOA's geographic boundaries. It acknowledged that Gerald Harmon's property had never been subject to HOA jurisdiction. It withdrew all prior correspondence, all violation notices, all forfeiture proceedings, retroactively, and in full. It did not contain the word sorry. It did not contain an apology of any kind. But it surrendered on every single point, completely, without condition. Gerald received his copy on a Friday afternoon. He read it standing in his kitchen. He folded it, put it in the same drawer where he kept his grandfather's original land survey documents. and went outside to check on his cattle. Patricia Kellner remained on the HOA board for 8 more months before resigning, citing personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. 2 other board members resigned alongside her. The residents who remained held new elections. The new board's first official act was to formally repeal the aesthetic corridor policy. They also commissioned an independent legal review of every enforcement action taken under the previous board's leadership. That review identified over 60 enforcement actions that may have been legally unsupportable. At least 11 homeowners who had paid fines requested refunds. 7 of those requests were honored. The remaining 4 were still under review as of the time this story was researched. Gerald Harmon still lives in his farmhouse. The barn is still the same deep red his grandfather chose in 1952. The hay storage structure is still standing. The cattle still graze in the north pasture. Nobody from the Sycamore Ridge HOA has contacted him since the day that final letter was sent. His recorded lien interest remains exactly where it was. On file, clear, legally valid. Gerald has no current plans to enforce it. He never did. But every real estate attorney in Henderson County knows it exists. Because Dale Whitfield made sure of that when he filed the formal notice. And because the public record does not lie and does not disappear. When someone who knows Gerald well was asked to describe his reaction to all of it, to being threatened with losing his family's land, and then watching the people who threatened him retreat in silence. The answer was simple. He didn't go looking for a fight. They brought one to his door. He just made sure they understood what door they were knocking on. Gerald Harmon's barn is still red. It always will be. And somewhere in a drawer beside his grandfather's survey maps, there is a 4-page letter that the most powerful people in his neighborhood sent to him. Folded and filed, and never thought about again, because the man they sent it to gave them every reason in the world to forget it ever happened.